Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Down most of the time now. My shoulders are always tense and I jump at the smallest noises. Sometimes I feel like I catch a flicker of that face in the mirrors at work or in the dark window of my living room at night. It never fully goes away. I've learned to live with the fear by pushing it aside, but it's always there in the back of my mind. Every day I board that train, and every day I hope maybe it'll be gone. But when I glance at the window, I see it waiting, staring, as if it wants me to know that it's never left. I work as an archivist at an old university. Late one night, I was sorting piles of documents in a cramped storage room. My back hurt from bending over stacks of dusty folders, and my eyes felt heavy. I just wanted to wrap up and go home. Then I noticed a faint outline in the far wall. It looked like a small crack that formed a perfect rectangle. I ran my fingers over it and felt a slight draft. That was strange because there were no windows or obvious vents. The air coming through the crack felt cooler than the stale storage room. I pressed on the rectangle and part of the wall shifted. That's when I realized it was a hidden door. I pushed it open. The hinges squeaked and the door swung inward. Dust floated in the air. The room beyond smelled like old paper and damp stone. I fumbled for my flashlight. The corridor was narrow, with rough walls and a low ceiling. My heart pounded, but curiosity overrode any hesitation. I stepped forward, shining the flashlight around. The corridor led to a set of stone steps descending into darkness. I wondered how long this passage had been here. I'd never heard of any underground levels besides the official basement archives. This wasn't on any blueprint I'd seen. I went down the steps slowly. My breathing sounded loud in the cramped space. Each footstep echoed. At the bottom, I reached a thick wooden door. It had an old-fashioned lock, but it was slightly ajar. I pushed it with my shoulder and it opened with a scraping noise. The smell of mildew rushed out along with something else. It was like the smell of old books left in a damp attic for too long, but sharper. The hair on my arms stood up. I felt a mild chill on my neck. Inside, I found a massive room filled with shelves. Each shelf had dozens of old books, stacked from floor to ceiling. I couldn't see the far end with my small flashlight. My knees felt shaky. I didn't expect something this big under the university. I whispered to myself, "This is insane." Then I noticed that some of the books on the nearest shelf looked in decent shape, despite the obvious humidity in the air. The spines were intact, but the covers were coated in dust. I stepped closer to one shelf and aimed the flashlight at a thick volume with a dark cover. Its title wasn't in English. The letters looked foreign, maybe Latin or something older. My hand shook a bit when I reached out to touch it. The cover felt cold and stiff. I tried to open it, but the pages were stuck together at first. Then they loosened with a crackling sound, and I flipped through. The words on the pages looked handwritten in different inks. Some pages were so faded that I could barely see anything. Suddenly, the pages started to turn on their own. I jerked my hand away. There was no breeze in the room. My flashlight beam flickered across the paper, and I saw the words shifting. It looked like they were rearranging on the page. I felt a tightness in my chest. I let go of the book and stepped back. My pulse was rapid. My legs felt stiff. I swallowed and tried to keep calm. Maybe I was imagining things. I took a couple of steps away from the shelf, trying to slow my breathing. I panned my flashlight across the rows of shelves. Some books looked older than anything I'd ever handled. There was something unsettling about them. I heard a faint rustling sound, like pages turning or dry leaves scraping across stone. I couldn't pinpoint the source. I felt my scalp tighten, and my mouth went dry. Then I saw a small wooden desk against the wall. There was a single chair in front of it. A book lay open on the desk. I walked over, shining my flashlight. The open book had handwritten notes all over the margins. The handwriting looked frantic, with big letters and underlined words. I leaned in to read. The notes were in English, scribbled between lines of text in some other language. One note said, "They move when no one is looking." Another said, "Do not trust the whispers." My stomach felt heavy and I had a sudden urge to get out. I heard a slight scraping sound behind me, and I spun around. Nothing was there, but my hand trembled and my flashlight shook. I took a few deep breaths. The air felt thick and I struggled to clear my mind. I decided to head back to the door. I needed to report this or at least come back with better lighting. But as I turned to go, I realized I couldn't see the entry door. The corridor I came from was not where I remembered. Instead, I saw more shelves and another passage to the left. I frowned and walked in that direction, certain that was where I'd come from. I found another set of shelves and a brick wall at the end. I went back to the main area. I walked in circles trying to spot the stone steps or the wooden door. They were gone. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My throat felt tight. This made no sense. I spoke out loud, but my voice sounded weak in the large space. "Hello? Is anyone here?" My words echoed a bit. There was no response. I focused on staying calm. I walked along the perimeter of the room, shining my flashlight on the walls. Eventually, I came across a different corridor. The hallway branched in two directions. It was cramped with shelves built into the walls, each loaded with more books. I thought maybe I could find some sign or marker that would lead me back to the exit. I took the left corridor first. My foot kicked something on the floor. It was a small stool with a thick layer of dust. It looked like someone used it to reach higher shelves. I listened carefully. The silence weighed on me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then faintly I heard a whisper. It sounded like my name, but the voice was distorted. My skin erupted in goosebumps and I felt my chest tighten again. I swung the flashlight around, searching for the source, but saw nothing. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I rushed ahead, thinking maybe I could find a stairway or a sign of daylight. My footsteps echoed on the stone floor. I passed more shelves, more books, and more dark corners. The corridor twisted and turned. At one point, I found myself at a circular reading area with a single table and a lantern on it. The lantern was old, made of metal and glass. I shook it a little. It had a bit of oil left. I found a striker nearby. My hands shook, but I managed to spark the lantern. A small flame flickered inside it. I turned off my flashlight to save the battery and used the lantern's glow instead. It provided a wider pool of light, but it also cast moving shadows on the walls. That's when I noticed a movement in the corner of my eye. I turned. A tall shelf at the edge of the reading area had a slight sway, as if it had been nudged. The books on it seemed to shift. I froze, holding the lantern at chest level. My arms felt tight. I heard a low scraping sound like something sliding across the floor. My legs tensed up. I took a step back. Then I saw a flicker of movement among the books, but I couldn't tell if it was an insect, an animal, or something else. The shadows made it impossible to see clearly. I stood there, waiting. My breath was shallow. Nothing emerged from behind the shelf. I decided to keep moving. The corridors changed shape as I walked. One moment, I was in a narrow hall with the stone walls close on both sides. The next moment, I emerged in a larger room with a vaulted ceiling and tall shelves arranged like a maze. I tried to keep track by leaving small piles of dust or bits of paper on the floor as markers, but the paths still shifted. Each time I turned around, the environment looked different. My sense of direction fell apart. I realized this place was not normal. It felt controlled by something. The whispers happened more often. Sometimes they sounded right next to my ear, so clear that I turned around expecting to see someone. Other times I heard them far away, like a breath carried by a breeze. Each time I felt my stomach tighten and my heart rate spike. I wondered if the library itself was alive. I tried not to think about it too hard. I wanted to focus on getting out. I kept telling myself, I need to find out why this place was sealed off. That might give me a clue. I remembered the manuscript on the desk with those warning notes. If I could find it again, maybe there would be more details about how to leave. I wandered back through the corridors, scanning for the desk. My lantern started to dim, so I turned it down to preserve the oil. Everything got darker, and my anxiety rose. I touched the wall to guide myself. It felt damp and cold. I heard my name whispered again. This time I shouted, "Stop it!" My voice echoed. My throat was dry. My hands trembled. I spotted the desk in a small alcove. The open manuscript still lay there, but now it was on a different page. I leaned in, adjusting the lantern. The notes in the margin said, "They feed on knowledge. They do not want to kill. They want a mind to open the path." Another line read, "The books record everything that enters. Don't let them record you." I rubbed my eyes, feeling the weight of confusion. I turned more pages, looking for an explanation of how to leave. The original text was illegible to me. The notes in English jumped around, mentioning shifting hallways and living corridors. One line caught my attention. The reason it was sealed. It grew too large. People got lost. We locked it to stop more wandering souls. My heart pounded. I realized I might be trapped here if I didn't figure out how to reverse whatever is powering this place. Then I found a final note that said, "Find the original seal in the main corridor. Break the power by closing the circle and reversing the wards." I had no idea what wards meant in a literal sense, but it was the only clue I had. I lifted the manuscript, deciding to carry it with me so I could consult the notes. As I did, I heard a scratching on the floor behind me. I swung around, raising the lantern. I saw a shape near the edge of the light. It was low to the ground, maybe the size of a large cat. I couldn't make out details. My eyes strained. Then it scuttled away and I heard the scrape of claws on stone. My heart hammered. I felt a rush of cold sweat across my shoulders. Clutching the manuscript to my chest, I headed back into the corridor. I kept glancing behind me. My steps echoed, and my breathing was ragged. I forced myself to keep moving. After a while, I came to a wide hallway that looked more structured than the twisting paths. The floor was made of evenly cut stones, and the ceiling had a row of hanging lanterns all unlit. I saw a symbol etched into the floor, a circle with strange markings around its edge. It was about 2 feet across. I knelt down, carefully placing my lantern beside it. The manuscript mentioned something about closing the circle. I looked at the circle and the wards around it. They seemed like old runes or letters I couldn't identify. Following the notes, I tried to replicate what they described. I used a piece of chalk from my pocket, something I normally carry for labeling boxes in the archives. I traced the outer ring, noticing it was incomplete on one side. The chalk lines had to connect to form a full loop. My hands shook as I drew. I breathed slowly, telling myself to stay focused. Once I connected the circle, I placed my hand on it. Nothing happened at first. Then I felt a faint vibration in the floor. The circle glowed for a split second, or maybe it was my eyes playing tricks. A low rumble moved through the walls. I stood up, heart racing. The hallway shifted. I saw the stones in the walls move like sliding panels. A new opening appeared to my right. My lantern flickered, but I grabbed it and the manuscript. I walked toward that opening, stepping over loose stones. Inside, I saw a short tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, there was a set of stone steps leading up. A faint draft of fresher air hit me. I moved quickly, almost stumbling in my rush. The steps were worn and the air was cooler as I ascended. When I reached the top, I saw a wooden door. My palms were sweaty, but I pushed on it, and it opened into the same storage room I'd started in. The hidden door clicked shut behind me as soon as I stepped out. I turned around to see if it was still visible, but the wall looked solid again. No seam, no crack. I dropped onto a nearby stool, panting. My clothes stuck to my skin. My heart pounded so hard that my chest hurt. I set the manuscript on a table and stared at it under the dim overhead light. The cover was worn, and the strange script shimmered slightly. Part of me wanted to throw it back inside, but I knew I couldn't. Someone else would eventually discover that library and face the same nightmare. I needed to protect them from it. My plan was to lock the door from the outside, but there was no visible latch or keyhole. So I covered the entire area with heavy boxes and old shelving units, hoping to hide it. Then I left the storage room and headed straight for the head librarian's office. I felt the cold sweat drying on my body as I walked. My thoughts were jumbled, but I knew one thing. That hidden library wasn't normal. It wasn't just a room with books. It was something bigger, something that changed the space around it, something that made me question everything I knew about the university. Even though I escaped, I could still feel the presence behind the walls. I heard faint whispers in my mind, like the echo of that voice calling my name. My hands trembled, and I wiped them on my pants. I hoped never to set foot in that library again. That's my story. I found a hidden door and stumbled into a library that shouldn't exist. The books there move on their own. The corridors shift, forcing you deeper. There's something crawling in the darkness, calling out in a voice that shouldn't be. I only got out because I followed clues in a strange manuscript and sealed something I don't fully understand. Now, I just want to forget the smell of damp stone and old paper. I want to forget the feeling of pages turning by themselves. But I can't forget, because every time I'm alone in the archives, I feel a cold breeze. And sometimes, I swear I hear my name whispered from behind the walls. I still remember how my legs tensed up the first time I realized something was off in that underground parking garage. I was heading to my car late, like usual, and I felt this deep pressure in my chest. I'm used to working long hours, but I'm not used to feeling that kind of weight on my body. My neck felt stiff and my fingers shook while I pressed the button on my car key. I heard the distant echo of a car engine from another level, but I didn't see anyone else around. That was the start of everything. I didn't talk to anyone about it at first. I thought maybe I was just tired or stressed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking down there. I work in an office tower downtown. The building has a few underground parking levels. They're dimly lit with long rows of concrete columns and lines of empty parking spaces. It's never cheerful down there, but for a while, I just assumed it was my own mind playing tricks on me. I'd get out of the elevator, hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, and see my reflection in car windows. My breathing would speed up a bit, and I'd sometimes grip my key ring too hard. But I always told myself it was fine. I told myself I was being paranoid. One evening I had to stay past midnight. A client needed documents and I was stuck with the revisions. By the time I was done, I was the only person left on the floor. The hallway lights were on a timer and they kept turning off, leaving me with those emergency lights along the baseboards. My eyes felt heavy. My back was sore from sitting at my desk. I decided to pack up and head home. I took the elevator down to the parking levels. When the doors opened, I realized the lights were flickering more than usual. They'd flicker sometimes, but not in a long, steady pattern. That night, they kept pulsing on and off. The floor looked damp, and I noticed a light sheen on the concrete. I assumed maybe a pipe had burst. I smelled something stale in the air, kind of like stagnant water, but I couldn't identify it. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, stepped out, and started walking toward my car. As I moved between the rows, I heard this faint scraping sound. I stopped and looked around. Nothing moved. No one was there. I tried to ignore it and kept going. Then I heard it again, a little louder. It was like something hard scratching against the concrete or maybe against the wall. My shoulders tensed and I gritted my teeth. I aimed my key fob at my car to unlock it and heard the usual beep. Then the scraping stopped. The flickering lights hummed overhead. I got in my car and locked the doors right away. My hands were shaking, and I had this knot in my stomach. I started the engine, and the headlights lit up the row in front of me. I noticed a dark shape move behind one of the columns. My heart pounded in my chest. I thought I was seeing things, so I blinked a few times, but I swear I saw some figure slipping out of sight. I waited a few seconds, but I didn't see it again. I reversed out of my space, not taking my eyes off the columns. The shape didn't reappear. I left the garage feeling uneasy. The next few nights I tried to leave earlier, but I still ended up working late. The same unsettling tension filled the air when I went down to the parking garage. I started to notice scratch marks on the concrete walls near the elevator doors. They looked shallow, like thin grooves in the surface. Sometimes I saw wet footprints on the floor in places that didn't make sense. They'd stop abruptly, leading nowhere. I heard distant breathing a couple of times, like someone gasping after a sprint, but I never saw anyone else around. I kept telling myself it was just normal building noises or weird condensation, but I didn't really believe that. After a week or so, I decided to do a little digging. I looked up the building's history online. It took some effort, because the place changed owners a few times. Eventually, I found a handful of articles mentioning odd incidents during the construction phase. Workers had reported strange sightings in the subterranean levels. One article mentioned a rumored creature that some people claimed to have glimpsed near the support beams. The piece was full of speculation, so I didn't know if it was some urban legend or if there was any truth to it. But after what I'd experienced, I couldn't dismiss it completely. The next time I went down to the garage, I had this surge of adrenaline the moment I stepped off the elevator. The overhead lights buzzed. The air felt colder than usual. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I held my phone in my hand, ready to use its flashlight if necessary. I walked slowly, scanning every row of parked cars. I heard that faint scraping again. My chest felt tight, and my breath grew shallow. I tried to steady myself by focusing on my steps. My shoes made a dull echo on the concrete. As I reached my car, I saw a new set of scratch marks on the door to the janitorial closet. They looked fresh, with little flakes of paint on the ground beneath them. The lines were uneven, like they'd been made by something with a single sharp point. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach and unlocked my car. That's when I saw a dark shape in the corner of my eye. It moved quickly behind another row of vehicles. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I held my breath. I waited, but everything went quiet. I got in my car, locked it, and left as fast as I could. It went on like this for a while. Each time I had to stay late, I'd notice some new evidence of something living in that garage. Sometimes there were deep gashes in the concrete walls. Sometimes I'd find damp footprints or puddles that seemed to appear out of nowhere. One night, I even found a piece of fabric snagged on a protruding piece of metal near a column. It was dark and stiff, but I couldn't tell what kind of material it was. I started to wonder if I was dealing with an actual creature or some person who was lurking around for reasons I couldn't understand. I decided to talk to a coworker named Carlos. He'd been at the company longer than me, and he mentioned once that he'd seen a security guard quit suddenly after working the graveyard shift. I asked him if he knew anything about the parking garage. He gave me a look that told me he'd heard the rumors too. He said he'd never seen anything himself, but he'd heard about strange noises. He also said a few people refused to park down there after dark. I thanked him for the info and tried to get back to work, but my mind couldn't let it go. One night, I planned to gather more evidence. I brought a small digital camera with me and I decided to walk around the perimeter of the parking level before going to my car. It was late, so the place was mostly empty except for a few cars scattered around. I kept the camera in my hand, ready to record if I saw or heard anything unusual. I started near the elevator bank. The lights were still flickering in that slow, irritating pattern. My footsteps echoed around me. The air felt stale, and my throat felt dry. I saw more scratch marks along a low wall that bordered a row of parking spaces. I leaned closer to examine them. They looked deep, and the edges of each scratch felt rough to the touch. I turned on the camera and recorded a short clip, describing what I saw in a low voice. Then I moved toward the far side of the garage, where there was a small fenced-off area that stored maintenance equipment. As I approached, I heard this heavy breathing. It sounded damp and uneven, like someone struggling to get enough air. My pulse raced and my hands felt sweaty. I raised my camera, but I didn't see anything through the small screen. I took a few more steps. Then in the corner near a support column, I saw a shifting shape. It was hard to make out in the dim light. I pointed the camera in that direction, but the shape moved behind the column. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but I could hear my heart pumping in my ears. I stepped closer, thinking maybe I could capture some proof. My knees felt stiff and each step felt heavier. When I reached the column, I flicked on the camera's flashlight. I didn't see anyone. I heard a scraping noise behind me and I spun around. My light caught a glimpse of something near the floor, but it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't know what it was. It looked bulky, and I thought I saw a hint of a limb dragging along the concrete. The shock rattled through my body. My muscles tightened. I backed away and bumped into a metal cart. The sound echoed, and I cringed. I shone the flashlight around, but the shape was gone. I ran back toward my car, trying not to trip over my own feet. My breath came in short bursts and my chest hurt. When I reached my car, I dropped the camera while fumbling for my keys. The camera clattered to the ground, and I cursed under my breath. I snatched it up, unlocked the door, and got in. I started the engine, locked the doors, and immediately drove up the spiral ramp. I felt my body tingling from head to toe. I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw movement near the elevator bank, but I couldn't be sure. I focused on the exit until I finally got out on the street. At home, I tried to review the footage on my computer. My hands were still trembling while I inserted the memory card. Most of the video showed the dark corners of the garage and my own shaky flashlight beam. The audio picked up the sound of my breathing and some faint scraping noises. But I didn't see a clear image of the creature. All I had were a few frames of a dark blur near the floor, half hidden by the shadows. It wasn't enough to show anyone as proof. Over the next few days, I felt tired. I had trouble sleeping, and I kept thinking about that shape I saw. My coworkers noticed I looked drained. I avoided talking about it because I knew most people wouldn't believe me. I thought about parking in a nearby lot instead of using the underground garage, but I couldn't afford that expense. I also didn't want to give in to fear. Part of me wanted to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a raccoon or a large cat that got trapped in the building's lower levels. But the scratch marks seemed too large for a small animal. And that heavy breathing didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before. One evening, I tried asking the night security guard if he'd ever seen anything unusual downstairs. He stared at me for a few seconds, then said he wasn't allowed to talk about it. That was all he'd say. He just suggested I ask the building manager if I had any concerns. I didn't bother. The manager had always brushed off my questions about the flickering lights and the musty smell. I doubted he'd say anything about a creature in the garage. I kept working late, and the tension never left. Every time I stepped out of the elevator, I felt my heart rate climb. I'd walk faster than usual, keeping my car keys in one hand, ready to unlock the door as soon as I got close. My hands felt clammy, and my throat stayed dry. Sometimes I'd hear that scraping noise. Other times I'd smell something rank, like wet fur or damp concrete. Each time I'd look around and see nothing, but I could feel eyes on me. One night, the lights started flickering more intensely than before. I felt like I was trapped in a strobe effect. I heard a loud thump from the far side of the garage. Then I saw a shadow dart behind a truck. My whole body clenched, and I froze in place. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out, but my legs felt stiff. After a few seconds, I forced myself to hurry toward my car. I reached it and tried to slide the key into the lock, but my fingers were shaking so much that I dropped it. I heard that scraping sound getting closer. I grabbed the key off the ground and managed to open the door. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped off. My heart hammered in my chest the whole drive home. That was a week ago. I haven't seen the creature up close, but I've sensed it. The marks in the garage have multiplied. Sometimes I see fresh scratches that look deeper and sharper than before. Sometimes I see prints that look like a mix of handprints and footprints, but smeared in a way that doesn't match a normal person. I've been thinking about switching jobs, or at least asking for a day shift, but I need the money and I'm not sure if I can find something else easily. Each night I tell myself I'll just ignore it. I tell myself I'll park, keep my head down, and move fast. But some nights I feel like I'm walking into a trap. The tension in my neck is constant. My shoulders ache from staying hunched. My eyes water from straining to see through dim, flickering light. I feel that presence behind me, like it's waiting for me to make a mistake, to linger too long in one spot. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's some wild animal, some abandoned experiment, or something else. I just know it's there, and I know I'm not imagining it. The scratches and footprints are real. The scraping noises and the heavy breathing are real. The security guard's silence is real. The building's old stories are real, at least enough for me to believe them. This is my routine now. Every night I take the elevator down, my stomach tight. Every night I brace myself for that flicker of movement or the echo of scraping claws. Sometimes I see it, sometimes I don't. But the air still feels thick, and my nerves stay on edge. I can't say how long I can keep doing this. For now, I have no choice. I park there, I work the late shift, and I endure that sinking feeling every time I open my car door. I wish I had a neat conclusion. I wish I could say I confronted it, or that it turned out to be a stray dog. That hasn't happened. All I have is the same fear every night, the same signs that it's still around, and the same unanswered questions. I just know something is alive in that underground parking lot, and it's watching me, waiting in the shadows, and I can feel its presence every time I step off that elevator. I moved in last month on a Tuesday. My car was still packed with cardboard boxes, and I remember feeling an odd heaviness as I stepped into the house for the first time. The place was old, and the previous owner left a lot of his stuff behind. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around, but most of it was dusty and worn out. The attic was the last part of the house I visited, and from the moment I opened that squeaky wooden door in the ceiling, I felt something tense in the air. It wasn't a smell or a sound. It felt like standing too close to a static-charged TV. My arms prickled with a light electrical buzz. It was subtle at first, but it grew every time I came back. I noticed right away that the attic was filled with boxes, trunks, old lamps, and cracked mirrors. There were stacks of newspapers tied together with twine. Some had yellowed pages. There were metal coat hangers and a few old suitcases. In one corner, I saw an old television set. It had a big rounded screen and thick dials on the front. There was no cable, no obvious power cord sticking out, yet it sat there like a relic from a different era. I didn't think much of it at first. I just felt a bit uneasy. Something about that TV looked off, like it didn't belong even among all this junk. On the third day, I decided to do a proper exploration of the attic. I carried a flashlight because the single light bulb barely did anything. The dust was thick enough to choke me whenever I disturbed any boxes. I kept brushing it away from my face and blinking because my eyes started watering. I heard the floorboards under my feet creak and groan. Each step made my heart pound. The attic felt like it was holding its breath. I'd never been a superstitious person, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was up there with me. I started rummaging through the boxes. Most were filled with random housewares. Plates, cups, spoons, forks, chipped bowls, and broken glass. Some boxes had old clothes. They smelled moldy. I sneezed a lot. Then, I found a trunk with old VHS tapes and a few film reels. They were labeled with handwriting I couldn't read. I set them aside, thinking I might explore them later if I found something to play them on. Then I turned toward the television in the corner. It faced the wall, kind of angled toward a slanted part of the attic ceiling. It gave me the creeps because its screen reflected bits of light from my flashlight, and it made it look like it was glowing. I walked closer to it. I put my hand on top, and it was cold to the touch. I tried to find a power cord but didn't see one. The back had a missing panel, and the inside looked dusty. There were wires, but they didn't seem connected to anything. I shrugged it off. I assumed it was just junk. Then I heard a faint crackling sound. At first I thought I was imagining it. It was this soft, static noise, like a TV left on a dead channel. But the TV was clearly off. I peered at the screen, but all I saw was my own reflection and some of the dim light from the flashlight. I backed away, feeling my throat tighten. Then the static went silent. I tried to brush it off. Maybe something in the attic was just faulty. Old electronics could do weird things. I spent a few more hours up there, sorting boxes, writing labels, trying to organize. I kept an eye on that television, though. Every once in a while, I thought I heard a low hum. but it was so faint I couldn't be sure. I felt a tingling on my neck, like a draft passed by. But I didn't see any open vents or windows. I left the attic after that. I didn't want to stay up there any longer. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the old TV. I sat up in bed, picturing the shape of it in the corner, covered in dust yet somehow alive. Around midnight, I heard a short burst of static upstairs. It was just a single crackle, but it made my stomach flip. I turned on the lamp next to my bed and listened. My ears were tuned in for any noise, but everything went quiet again. I thought about going up there to check, but my legs felt numb. I couldn't bring myself to leave the comfort of my bedroom. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning. The next day, I tried to ignore the attic and focus on unpacking the rest of the house. There was plenty to do. The kitchen was a mess. The living room needed a complete cleaning. After a full day's work, I was sweaty and exhausted, so I took a shower, made a quick dinner, and tried to relax. But every time I glanced at the attic door and the hallway ceiling, I felt the same electric tension creeping over me. Around 10 at night, I heard it again. That static crackle. It lasted a few seconds longer this time, almost like the TV was powering up. I froze by the sink and stared at the ceiling. I thought I was losing my mind. My heartbeat kicked up, and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. Then it cut out just as sudden as it started. I went to bed, but I couldn't settle down. I kept picturing that dark shape up there, and my own mind filled in details of weird shadows and flickers on the wall. I convinced myself to check the attic the following morning, just to prove it was my imagination. When I climbed the ladder and opened the attic door, everything looked normal. The boxes were the same. Nothing seemed out of place except for one thing. The TV was now facing a different direction. Instead of facing the wall, it was turned around, screen pointed toward the door. I stared at it for a good minute, trying to remember if I had moved it. I didn't think so. My pulse started racing, and the back of my neck felt clammy. I walked over and gently nudged the TV to see if it was loose on the floor. It wasn't. It was steady. It wouldn't just turn by itself. My stomach knotted up. I reached around to see if a cord had magically appeared, but there was nothing. That was when I saw a faint shadow on the wall behind it. It looked like a person's outline, but it was flickering. There was no one else in the attic, and it couldn't have been mine because of where I was standing. I noticed it only for a second, and when I moved the flashlight, it vanished. I left the attic immediately. My hands were shaking, and my chest felt tight. I spent the rest of the day trying to think rationally. Maybe a draft pushed the TV. Maybe some reflection created that shadow. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. That evening, I sat in my living room with the lights on. I tried watching a movie, but I couldn't focus. Around 11, I heard the static again. This time, it sounded stronger. I stood up and felt my breath catch in my throat. The attic door was closed, but I could swear I saw a faint light shining through the cracks. It was like the flicker of a TV on a low channel. I felt my legs tremble. My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone, but my curiosity and fear drove me up the ladder. I pushed open the attic door. The room was darker than usual, but the TV screen was lit with pale static, even though it wasn't plugged in. I felt a jolt in my chest as I stared at that flickering image. It wasn't showing any station or channel, just swirling black and white noise. Then I noticed the shadow on the wall behind the TV. It looked like a person standing with their arms hanging at the sides. The figure was larger than I remembered. Its edges moved with the static, like it was breathing. I stayed at the top of the ladder, not daring to step fully inside. My heart pounded so hard that my hands started to go numb. As I watched, the shadow seemed to bend an arm toward me. I swallowed hard, and my eyes burned from not blinking. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the ladder. I flicked the light switch on the wall, but the attic bulb just flickered once and burned out. Total darkness. All I had was the glow from the static. I heard my own breathing echo in that cramped space. The shadow was still there, shifting with the static. I couldn't move. My knees locked and my muscles felt weak. Then I heard a sharp click from the TV. The static cut out for a moment, replaced by silence. The screen went black. I started to feel relief, but then it clicked back on, crackling louder than before. The shadow on the wall grew in size. It moved upward, like it was lifting itself. I gasped and scrambled down the ladder. I almost twisted my ankle on the way down. I slammed the attic door shut and ran to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, panting. My shirt was soaked in sweat. My mind was racing with pure panic. I stayed up the entire night listening for any sign of more static. The silence was somehow worse. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid the attic. I kept busy with work and tried to spend as much time away from the house as I could. But every night, I heard those bursts of static. Sometimes I heard them just a few times, sometimes more. I felt like I was losing control. My hands would shake whenever I approached the attic ladder. My mouth went dry thinking about that shadow. I noticed each night it took on new positions. Once I heard the static and poked my head up just enough to see the screen from the top of the ladder. The shadow was leaning forward, as if crouched. Another time, it seemed to stretch across the wall, like it was reaching for the boxes. It was never in the same spot or shape twice. The worst part was the sense that if I looked at that TV too long, something would happen. The screen's static wasn't just random noise. Sometimes I saw shapes in it, like glimpses of buildings or old-fashioned rooms. It was never clear, always distorted. But every time I caught a hint of an image, I felt a tug in my stomach, like I was being pulled forward. My vision blurred. My head felt light. I had to snap my eyes away before I lost my sense of where I was. Each time that happened, I felt more drained. My appetite sank, and I started having trouble sleeping. One evening, I finally worked up the courage to get rid of the TV. I grabbed a big tarp from the garage and went upstairs. It was around 6 in the evening, still some sunlight outside, so the attic wasn't pitch black. The TV was there, silent, but I felt the usual tingling in the air. I spread the tarp on the floor, planning to wrap the TV and drag it out. As soon as I touched it, I heard a soft crackle from inside. My heart pounded. I lifted the TV a few inches and it felt heavier than it should have for such an old piece of equipment. It slipped out of my grip and the screen clattered against the floor. Suddenly the static popped on and I stumbled backward. I forced myself to grab it again, ignoring the static. My arms shook as I hauled it onto the tarp. The picture hissed and flickered. The shadow on the wall jumped and twitched. My neck felt hot and a cold sweat ran down my spine. I pulled the tarp around the set, trying to cover the screen, but the static glow seeped through. When I turned to look at the wall, the shadow had grown larger. Its head shape was tilted, as if it was watching me. My heart hammered so hard I felt dizzy. I dragged the wrapped TV across the attic floor toward the ladder. Every inch was a fight. The TV felt stuck to the floor sometimes, like it didn't want to move. The static got louder with each pull. My ears rang and my eyes burned from the dust I kicked up. By the time I reached the ladder, I realized I couldn't carry it down alone. It was too heavy and awkward. I considered pushing it through the opening, but I was worried about damaging the ladder or getting stuck halfway. My arms trembled with exhaustion. I stared at the attic door and cursed under my breath. That was when the static suddenly went silent. I froze. I looked over at the tarp, and the TV was still. The shadow was gone from the wall. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm down. My heart was pounding so loud I heard it in my ears. I realized it might be dangerous to force the TV down the ladder in this state, so I unwrapped it and set it back in a corner. I felt a surge of frustration that I couldn't remove it right then. I hated leaving it there, but I couldn't see an easy way to do it by myself. I ended up going downstairs, shutting the attic door and locking it with a small latch. It felt ridiculous to lock the door, but I needed any small sense of security I could get. That night I heard the static behind the attic door, but it was quieter. I still felt uneasy. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the next burst. My brain wouldn't shut off. My pulse stayed high. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that shadow changing positions, moving around the boxes, creeping across the walls. My mouth went dry whenever I thought about those flickers of old images on the screen. Sometimes, I convinced myself that if I went back up there and stared into the static, I might be pulled into whatever strange place was inside that swirling noise. I haven't looked into the TV screen for more than a few seconds at a time, and I intend to keep it that way. I'm still figuring out how to get rid of it safely. I might ask a friend to help me haul it out and take it to a dump. Until then, I keep that attic door locked. Some nights the static is loud, almost like it's calling me. Other nights it's just a faint hum. But I know it's there, and I know the shadow is there too. I can feel that same electric tension in the air whenever I walk under the attic. My skin prickles, and I feel short of breath. I have no idea where this thing came from or why it's messing with me. I only know that it's not just some broken TV. It's something else, and it wants me to look deeper into that screen. I'm doing everything I can to resist. Until I figure out how to remove it, I have to live with that unblinking, static-filled presence up there in the attic. And every night I wonder if the shadow has moved again. I noticed a stale smell the moment I stepped into the smaller exhibition hall. It felt thick in my lungs, like the air had been sitting still for a while. I moved from painting to painting, searching for something that would spark a new idea for my own work. I had seen plenty of landscapes and portraits, but none of them stood out. My eyes felt tired. The lighting in the room was dim, and there were only a few people wandering around. The place felt quiet, except for the occasional echo of footsteps on the polished floor. After a few minutes, I saw an odd painting hanging on a far wall. It was larger than the others, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The frame was a dark wooden design, but it looked old and had some chipped spots at the corners. I took a few steps closer and caught a whiff of mold. It wasn't strong, but it triggered an immediate sense of unease. I leaned in to see if the surface looked damaged by moisture. Instead, I saw a strange sheen on the paint, like it hadn't dried. The texture seemed soft and wet. I didn't touch it right away, but I could tell something was off. The guard stationed near the entrance seemed bored. He was flipping through a small booklet and didn't pay much attention to me. I decided to stand there, looking at the painting a bit longer because I felt an odd pull. The image showed a dark scene, possibly a room with broken furniture. It was hard to tell what exactly was inside that room, but I noticed warped shapes and what might have been a door in the background. The brushstrokes looked thick. The paint had a glossy shine under the weak lights. I reached out with one finger very carefully and grazed the surface. It felt tacky, and a tiny bit of red paint smeared onto my fingertip. I wiped it on my pant leg without thinking. The smell of mold grew a little sharper. It was like the painting had some kind of moisture trapped in it. I wanted to ask someone about it, so I looked around for a curator or a staff member who might know more. I only found a part-time worker near the main desk who didn't seem very familiar with the pieces. He gave me a short explanation. The painting came from a private collection, and it was set to be auctioned the following day. He shrugged when I asked about the wet paint. I felt frustrated, but I kept staring at the piece. I didn't recognize the artist's name on the small placard underneath it. It looked like a smeared signature, G. Torrance, or maybe G. Torrance. Hard to read. The next day I showed up for the auction. I told myself I'd just watch and see how much it would go for, but part of me wanted to bid. There weren't many people there, and the painting appeared near the end of the list. The bidding started low. Nobody seemed interested. The auctioneer described the piece in a dry monotone. I decided to raise my paddle, thinking I'd at least test the waters. A few seconds passed. No one else raised a paddle. The hammer went down. I won it for a price that felt surprisingly cheap. A staff member congratulated me and handed me a payment form. I signed it, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. I asked about the painting's condition, but they said there was no official record of any damage or odd qualities. I asked if they noticed the paint was still wet, and they just shrugged. Nobody had any information. I arranged for the painting to be delivered to my apartment the next day. My place isn't very big, but I have a corner set up as a little atelier, with my easel and brushes and tubes of paint all over the place. I cleared a spot on the wall opposite my main work table. When the delivery guys brought the painting, I noticed the smell right away. They wrinkled their noses and one of them said it smelled moldy, but they left it at that. I tipped them, shut the door, and just stood there with this large painting leaning against the wall, still wrapped in brown paper. I unwrapped it carefully. The frame had that same old look with some fresh scratches from transport. When I placed my hand near the surface, I felt cold air, like the painting radiated a chill. I decided to hang it on the wall. As I lifted it, I felt a thin drip of something wet slide down and touch my wrist. I flinched. The liquid was cold, and it made me shiver. I pulled away, checked the back of the painting, and saw a small damp spot on the canvas. It felt slimy. I used a rag to wipe it off and then hung the painting. That night I woke up around 2 in the morning. I don't remember any dreams, but I sat up feeling uneasy. My heart was beating hard. My room was dark except for the faint glow of a streetlight through the curtains. I listened for any sounds. Nothing but a distant car outside. My atelier is right next to the bedroom, and I could smell something. It was the musty odor of the painting. It seemed stronger now. I got out of bed and walked into the studio area. The painting was still on the wall, but when I turned on the overhead light, I saw fresh streaks of red on the floor underneath. A few drops had splattered. I knelt down and touched a drop. It was wet paint. My stomach clenched. I cleaned it up with a rag, but I felt uneasy. I looked at the painting and noticed a new detail in the corner, something that looked like a figure crouched in the shadows of that broken room. I didn't remember seeing that shape before. I blamed my tired eyes and decided to go back to bed. In the morning, I woke up late, around 9. I walked into my atelier with a cup of coffee. The smell almost made me gag. It was damp and unpleasant like rotten wood. I opened a window for fresh air. Then I looked at the painting again. Now there was a figure at the center, right in the middle of the painting. It wore what looked like a dark coat, and the face seemed blurry, as if someone had smeared the paint while it was wet. My first thought was that someone had broken in and vandalized the painting. But there were no signs of forced entry, and my door was locked. Also, it looked too detailed to be random vandalism. The figure had a certain posture. I leaned in close, realizing the coat looked eerily similar to one I used to wear years ago. I could see cracks in the paint where it had dried in some spots, but the fresh details glistened in the daylight. I felt my heartbeat thudding in my chest. I wanted to touch the wet spots, but I felt nervous. I ran my finger along the side, and sure enough, the paint was damp. It came off on my fingertip. The drop had a dark red hue. It reminded me of thickened oil paint that hadn't fully set. My skin crawled. I walked to my phone and tried to call the gallery, but nobody picked up. I left a message asking if they had sold me a damaged piece. My voice cracked a bit. I hated how that sounded, but I couldn't help it. Over the next few days, the painting changed more. Each morning, new details showed up. Broken furniture pieces became clearer, and the figure in the center seemed to inch closer to the foreground. My atelier felt colder. The damp smell lingered in every corner. I tried covering the painting with a cloth, but the cloth got stained overnight with wet paint. Every time I touched it, the cold, slimy texture made my stomach churn. I even checked the walls around the painting and found small smudges of paint. I wiped them off, but by the next day they returned, spreading across the plaster like a faint rash. One afternoon, while I was painting my own piece, I heard a soft drip. It was the sound of liquid hitting the plastic cover on the floor. I turned around and saw dark paint dripping from the lower edge of the mysterious canvas. It looked thicker than before, almost like tar. The smell was overpowering. I tried to clean it up with a rag, but it smeared across the floor and stained my hands. I tried soap and water, but the stain clung to my skin for hours. I felt panicked, like the paint was burrowing into my pores. I started noticing that the painting scene looked a bit like a twisted version of one of my old studios. The furniture arrangement was similar to a layout I had years ago, and the walls had the same cracks that used to run through the place I rented back then. The figure wore that dark coat I used to have, the one I threw out after it got ruined in heavy rain. My mouth went dry each time I realized these connections. I couldn't explain how a painting from someone I didn't know showed details of my life. At night, I had trouble sleeping. I heard faint sounds like someone knocking inside the walls. I turned on the lights and walked around, but I never found anything. My atelier felt suffocating. The air was damp and the corners of the room looked darker, as if the paint had seeped into the walls. I tried to ignore it, but every morning I woke up to more smudges on the walls. Tiny streaks of paint ran along the baseboards. I wiped them away, but they always came back. One night I heard a sharp tapping sound from the painting itself. I got out of bed, flicked on the light, and stared at the canvas. The surface seemed to pulse. I took a step closer. The figure in the painting had moved. It was in the foreground now, staring out from the canvas. The face was still smeared, but I saw hints of features that reminded me of my own face. My chest tightened. I swallowed hard and looked away. I grabbed a hammer, pulled the painting off the wall, and carried it to the corner. I was done letting it hang there. I considered throwing it out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about it made me freeze whenever I tried. That night, the smell spread to my bedroom. It was in my clothes, in my sheets, even in my hair. I took a shower, scrubbing my skin until it felt raw, but the odor lingered. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. My thoughts were jumbled. I kept thinking about the painting's wet surface, the changes in the images, the figure that looked like me. The sense of violation kept growing, like something was creeping into my personal space. The next morning, I found paint stains on the outside of the cloth I'd thrown over the painting. The paint had seeped through and formed shapes on the cloth. I pulled the cover off and saw new elements in the painting. A set of shelves with scattered brushes and tubes of paint. I recognized them as items from my current atelier. It felt like the painting was documenting my life, but in a warped, unsettling way. My throat felt tight, and I broke into a cold sweat. I tried contacting the auction house again. No answer. I emailed the museum. They sent a generic reply saying they had no record of any unusual condition. I felt alone with this growing problem. I decided to move the painting into my living room, away from my work area. I covered the walls of the living room with plastic sheets. I set up a fan to help clear the smell, but it barely made a difference. The painting still dripped. Every time I checked it, more details appeared. A cracked window that looked just like one in my bedroom. Stains on the floor resembling the ones in my hallway. It was tracking my world, piece by piece. At one point, I stood there, staring at the painting, and I felt dizzy. My palms were sweaty. I heard a faint squishing sound behind me. I turned and saw a trail of wet paint creeping along the wall from the atelier doorway. The paint had a dark color, somewhere between brown and black, and it looked thick. I tried to wipe it up, but it just smeared and made the smell worse. My eyes watered. My hands shook. My heart thumped in my ears. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in. I struggled to breathe through my mouth to avoid inhaling that rancid odor. Later that evening, I tried to paint one of my own canvases, hoping it would distract me, but I couldn't concentrate. My attention kept drifting to the living room, where the wet painting sat in the corner, dripping. My body felt tense, and every small noise made me flinch. A loose floorboard creaked, and I jumped. I stared at the door, expecting to see more paint seeping in. When I finally went to check on it, I saw that the painting had changed again. The figure was no longer inside the broken room. Instead, it stood in what looked like my current apartment, near the living room window. The background showed plastic sheets pinned to the walls. I felt my knees weaken. That was my setup right now. I could even see the reflection of my own easel in the background. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The moldy odor made me cough. I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, door locked, lights on. I heard dripping noises, a soft tapping, and occasionally a wet squelch, like something thick was sliding across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the tension knotted my shoulders and made my muscles ache. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. My eyes were red and I had a throbbing headache. I opened the door and found smears of paint stretching from the living room into the hallway. The floor felt sticky under my bare feet. I gagged at the stench. When I finally stepped into the living room, I saw that the painting now showed a figure standing right at the edge of the canvas, with a hand reaching out. The hand was coated in wet paint. It left streaks across the surface. It looked like an invitation or a threat. My stomach churned. I approached it slowly. The paint on the frame was slick, and droplets fell to the floor in steady intervals. My breathing grew shallow. I was afraid to touch it, but I didn't know what else to do. I stood there trembling, my skin coated in a cold sweat. I could feel my heart hammering as I tried to figure out my next step. My apartment was cluttered with plastic sheets and stained rags. My eyes stung from the smell of mold and paint. I knew I couldn't live with this painting any longer. I had to get it out, or I had to leave. I felt like the walls were bending inward, closing me off from fresh air and sunlight. The painting seemed alive, an extension of something I couldn't understand. I took one last look at the figure's smeared face. It resembled me. I saw the shape of my jaw, the slope of my nose, and the coat I had long ago. My mind was a wreck. My nerves felt shredded. I had to escape that room. I dropped the rag on the floor, turned, and stumbled out into the hallway. I left the door open, letting the cold draft sweep through. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew I couldn't stay there. My only thought was to find a place without that smell, without those dripping sounds, without that creeping paint that followed me everywhere. I left the painting behind for a moment, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still smell it on my clothes, and I could still feel the chill on my skin. I still remember how the fog felt on my skin that night. It clung to my arms and made my hair feel damp and heavy. I was standing near the old fountain in the center of the square, trying to figure out which route would get me home the fastest. I had stayed out later than usual, hoping to avoid the weekend crowds in this tourist town. People come here all the time, searching for the older parts of the city with their hidden alleys and ghost stories.